Helen, for those that haven't come across you online, introduce yourself and let our listeners know what we're talking about today.
My name is Helen Sairany. I am the CEO and the Executive Vice President for Florida Pharmacy Association. I do that for work, but outside of work, I love to write. I find a lot of joy in writing. And my passion is in trauma, and that is basically work-related trauma, family-related trauma, racial trauma. So I find a lot of joy in exploring, human behavior and how trauma is related to everyday today operation or day-to-day of our life. So I do that for the site, and on a busy day, you would probably find me in the office advocating on behalf of pharmacists in my great state of Florida.
So Helen, when you and I spoke a little bit before the show, I said, Helen, we don't really talk about medicine on here because I'm not smart enough. And I said, when we're talking trauma, you're not talking about how pharmacists help patients with trauma. You're talking about pharmacists and maybe other healthcare workers that have trauma themselves.
Correct. It's unfortunately, we live in a society that exploits trauma in all of us, especially coming out of the pandemic. For the last 2 years, we've all got a flavor of it. So the question that is worth asking is not about who has trauma and who doesn't. It's more about where are you in the scale of trauma? Are you 7 out of 10? Are you 10 out of 10? Are you 5 out of 10? And why is this question so important? Is because we're social creatures, right? And the last 2 years, we've all lived in socially distant from our loved ones, and we were deprived of something that is very essential to our being as, social creatures. But when you're not, having access to your loved ones, when you're not able to interact with your team, with your colleagues, it's very detrimental to the well-being of humans. And we saw a lot of tragedy. We saw, our loved ones suffering when we were not able to see them. And we had to make a lot of morally challenging decisions as providers because we were so limited with the resources and tools. So all in all, very traumatic. And a lot of pharmacists, doctors, nurses included, are coming out of the pandemic with signs and symptoms of PTSD. This is research proven, and it's a moment of reckoning in the healthcare profession as a whole. So pharmacists are not alone. We're also having other colleagues in the health profession who are equally impacted by the pandemic and are suffering from signs and symptoms of PTSD.
I think the problem, especially with men, is that when it comes time to talk about trauma, we have this ability to downplay what we're going through because we always compare it to, well, I didn't fight in Vietnam and I didn't have, children die of this or that. And it's like, there's plenty of trauma to go around. Deal with yourself and don't be afraid of that, because what might be traumatic for you might not be for someone else. But hey, they can get their own help. Let's focus on you right now.
That is so true. My second book is actually on the traumas we carry. And you would be surprised to learn that for every combat veteran, there are 10 American children who are growing up in traumatic environments. Now, there is a lot to be said about that, because when you're in a war zone and you're fighting the enemy, it makes sense that the source of your trauma is coming from the enemy. But when you are in the U.S. and the children are struggling from trauma, from the source that is supposed to be giving you love and affection. Yeah. Why is this important to understand? Because there is a lot of, lack of awareness about what trauma is supposed to be. Trauma is not limited to veterans. It's not limited to you going overseas in the middle of nowhere and getting in your battle zone and coming back with, flashbacks and, nightmares. It's about things that didn't happen to you that was supposed to happen to you. A child who is extremely vulnerable warrants attunement and attachment from a caregiver, but a caregiver being a pharmacist who's going through a burnout, and they are extremely taken emotionally, physically by the unbearable work conditions. They come home and they bring that burnout to them, to the family environment. And that stress state that the mother carries from the unbearable work conditions becomes a stress state of a child. And because a child doesn't have the mature cognitive development, they translate that stress state of a mother as, being their fault. And they take it as them being abandoned. They don't have that understanding that, well, mom is having a bad day at work. That is why she is not giving me the attachment and the attunement that I need so badly.
Yeah.
So this is important to understand, because we are going through a toxic culture that exploits trauma in all of us. And what is the significance of that on the children that are going to grow up with their own unfinished childhood business?
Yeah.
And they take that unfinished childhood business to the arena, and now their problem becomes their supervisor problem.
Yes.
So it's very significant, because that supervisor now, regardless of what they do, they're expected to be the parent that this individual never had because of the unbearable work condition. So this is one aspect of your question. The other aspect of men, not being so willingly to admit their vulnerability is because we live in a culture that promotes toxic masculinity. So you're expected to perform yourself in a certain way. You're expected to compare yourself to a certain way. And that is extremely unhealthy, because you're putting unrealistic expectations on yourself. And the more you are doing whatever it takes to fit in, the more you're disconnecting from yourself. And it's a matter of time for you to clash, because you just get tired of being someone that is not you. So there is two aspects to the question that you just presented.
And I imagine too, with trauma, when you have a clear enemy, when you've got someone who's coming at you and you can say, well, it's not my fault, I have an enemy, or when maybe your house was broken into and you have an enemy, that almost seems different than without an enemy. I think a lot of times you maybe start blaming yourself for that trauma. And I know you see it a lot, maybe with children who have been abused and stuff. There's not a clear enemy. And so that's almost harder because that blame is there.
So children by nature are narcissistic, they're egocentric. Now, I don't mean the bad narcissism and the bad egocentrism that we talk about, that the culture talks about, well, my boss is narcissistic. By nature, children, because they don't have that cognitive part of the brain developed yet, they personalize everything. Mom is having a bad day at work, well, I must be bad. Mom is not paying attention, so I feel abandoned. That is the egocentrism that I talk about. They personalize everything. So now, why is this important? It's they take that with them. So whatever doesn't mature, whatever doesn't get validated at a young age, it becomes part of your adult life. And you take that unfinished childhood business to your relationships and to the work environment. So a lot of time you might hear, well, this individual doesn't have emotional maturity, or this individual is acting like a child. That might be correct, not at a fault of their own. It's because they didn't grow up in a functional environment that validated their narcissistic needs. So there's a lot to be said about that narcissistic supervisor. That narcissistic supervisor probably is that adult child that was never validated for growing up in a dysfunctional family environment. And they take that unfinished business of narcissism to the work environment that makes the work environment unbearable to a lot of people. So there's a lot to be said about why understanding, the trauma 101 and how that could be significant in our work relationships, in our adult relationships, and developing an appreciation of why things evolve the way they do.
Yeah, I imagine in a lot of different environments, but let's say work. You've got people there, and probably all of us at some point, you might either be looking for something from somebody, or you might be seeing something in somebody that you despise. And sometimes that might be the same person. Exactly.
It is true. It's, and I've had gazillion experiences of those conflicting attributes in the individual, and it helps to understand where this individual is coming from, instead of that frustration because of the ego that they bring in, or the narcissism that they present. If you look at it from the trauma lens, you actually end up developing that compassion of some sort for this individual, and you realize, gee, I wonder what this individual had to go through, because they're craving for that attention. They're craving to show how important they are. And that's because they never were validated as a child by the caregiver of their narcissistic need. And they bring that to their adult life.
All right, let's talk about one of those bosses, those narcissistic bosses, and let's put it in the pharmacy setting. So Give me a setup. Give me an example of what we're seeing with narcissism from, let's say, a boss.
So in narcissism, I like to say there are three seeds that never coexist. But when they do, that it shows that this individual is having some signs and symptoms of narcissism. I would say charisma, confidence, and compassion. It's hard. It's hard for these three C's to show up, because if someone is really confident and charismatic, it's hard for them to be compassionate at the same time. But these narcissistic individuals, because they crave so much attention, they're willing to woo an individual, especially with job interviews. They are really, really masterful in job interviews, because they show that charisma, they show the confidence, they show the compassion that they will have for an individual. But let me tell you one thing, it's only a matter of time for them to clash, because having these three C's are extremely difficult to portray to the outside world. So they might, love bomb an individual or love bomb a staffer for a couple months, but it's only a matter of time for the true, authentic self that is deprived of love and affection from a caregiver to show up, and you realize that this individual is not what you thought it was. So a good example will be, how did this individual make it? Majority of narcissists make to the C executive level, because they crave leadership. And why is that important? Well, their craving for leadership means when they're in charge, it's less likely for them to be abused further.
That's
any
interesting.
further, because they're in charge, right? And there is just no way they can be violated. There is no way they can be traumatized, because they have the power. So that's how they look at it. Now, is every exec narcissistic? Probably not. But I would say leadership does, like they say, corrupt the corruptible. So if you have those features of narcissism, for sure, leadership is going to feed to that. But that doesn't mean that everybody in the C-suite is narcissistic. But if they have signs and symptoms of narcissism, or, they come to the position with signs and symptoms of narcissism, then definitely that's going to feed to that.
When you talk about the interview process, would that be both somebody who is trying to interview to rise up the ladder, or is it also the interviewer as a narcissist? Can they make the job sound too good and so on for the candidate that's trying to get a job? Is it both ways, or is it typically the narcissist is moving up the ladder with their charisma and so on?
I would say the individual who's going up the ladder, they have that deep craving for validation, for them to be in charge, so that it's less likely for them to be violated or traumatized like they were when they were younger.
What I've heard about narcissism too is that they've got these big walls, but if those walls crumble down, those walls are hiding a lot. So it's not just like somebody who is maybe knocked down a little bit. If you knock down a narcissist, everything crumbles, because that's what it's built on.
Exactly. They have behind this wall is a very fragile child. Very fragile child, deprived of their attachment and the attunement needs from the caregiver. So what they do over the years, they build these walls around them. What is this wall? This wall is all ego, degrees, accolades, executive positions, all the artificial stuff that they use to make them look good. But behind all the walls, it's a fragile child crying for affection, crying for attention, deprived of their, narcissistic needs, the good needs that a child needs from a caregiver, I would say.
Let's say that someone's listening to this and they're in community pharmacy or in hospital pharmacy. Let's say they're not dealing with the CEO or the C-suite. Are there narcissists that find their ways just into those levels too?
So narcissism can present itself in so many layers of life: as a significant other, as a colleague, as a friend, as a supervisor. They drain your energy. They exhaust you because it's all about them And then when you challenge them, they go through this hostility, trying to prove how you are out of line. The other thing that is good to watch out in these individuals is they are not good at following rules. So regardless of how much boundaries you put out there, they are notorious for violating your boundaries. So they're not good at following boundaries. They're not good in affectionate listening. They are, because it's all about them, because they're so deprived, right? So everything has to be about them. And narcissists are always the takers. They're not the givers. They're the takers in a relationship, regardless of what relationship we're talking about. And this could mentally, physically, emotionally drain the giver, because the giver, if you're an enabler, then you're pretty much making matters worse. But if you wake up to this pattern, it's usually too late. A lot of women actually get sucked into these relationships, and it kind of gets them into a vicious cycle over and over, because every time they try to get themselves out of a relationship, the narcissist, because of the competence, the confidence, the compassion, they suck the woman back into the cycle. And you realize in 15, 20 years, the woman finally wakes up as she realizes that her life has just been consumed by this vicious cycle. And when they finally get themselves out of it, they realize they've lost so much energy, spirituality, and a good life that they could have had if they ended the vicious cycle far earlier. This applies to relationships. This applies to work environments. Supervisors could do the same thing, just like how a significant other could suck you up into the vacuum of their narcissistic abuse. So it's very scary, but I would say it's important to look for them, some signs and symptoms. The 3 C's is what I like to focus on and to catch up to it. Yes.
When you say the 3 C's, you say compassion. That is not one they have, or is that one they fake?
They fake it, yes.
Oh, they fake it. They fake it.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. And it's only a matter of time, because it's just not sustainable.
Yeah.
I like to say it's too good to be true.
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
It's too good to be true in an interview. If it's too good to be true for like a date, if it's too good to be true for a staffer, if it's too good to be true for anything, red flags. It's important for you to, is this really too good to be true, or is this, it's, again, we're all adults and we just have to kind of make some wise decisions. Is this individual showing too much, too fast, too soon? And that is sign, the iconic definition of trauma, if they are showing too much, too fast, too soon. So a lot of victims of narcissistic abuse come out of the relationship with signs and symptoms of trauma. Mm-hmm. So if it's too good to be true, if it's too much, too fast, too soon, that's love bombing. Then that is a red flag that you should definitely be aware of and not to proceed with the relationship.
If we look at different, let's say, disorders or states of mental health, it seems a lot of them, like I've heard it said that everybody has X. It's when X gets out of control for you that it's a problem. So let's say we all have anxiety, and we all have some depression, and we all have some of this and all have some of that. When it rises up high enough, it's a problem. As I talked about narcissism having that wall, is narcissism the same, that it can rise up gradually, or because there's this highest level, people shoot up there and then they want to remain up there? Do we all have some narcissism in us?
Yeah, we do, for sure. We all do. It's about self-awareness. And you talked a little bit about mental health, Mike. Mental health, it's a construct. There is no such thing as a gene for depression. There is no such thing as a gene for schizophrenia or a gene for bipolar disease. If you really look into all constructs that is human-made, you will realize the common template of all mental health diseases is rooted back to childhood trauma. Okay? So to me, mental health disease, whatever it takes, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, ADHD, I don't know what, it's an outcome. It's an outcome of a life lived with its abnormalities, with its unbearable conditions, with its traumas. So the common root of all mental health diseases is trauma. But unfortunately, as pharmacists, as healthcare professionals, we don't get exposed to trauma training. We get exposed to signs and symptoms, the outcomes of trauma, but not enough exposure to the root cause of all these mental health diseases. Now, do we all have it? Absolutely. And that's what I started off. It's not about who has trauma and who doesn't. Where are you on the scale, right? And we all have genes. We all have genes of, cancerous genes. We all have genes for I don't know what. But remember, genes are not predetermination. They expose you to a Y disease, but they do not determine an XY disease. It's the environment. It's the environment that proliferates our gene, our, cell exposure through a science called epigenetics. So epigenetics, basically, I grew up to an immigrant family that survived war, that survived atrocities similar to Holocaust. Now, I was not a firsthand exposure to that, but I still have signs and symptoms of PTSD because of the epigenetics that I inherited from my family. Why is this important to understand? Because Mother Nature has developed my body in a way to better prepare me for the trauma that my mother or my father were exposed to. So, which means our mental state develops in the mother's womb. If the mother is stressed out, that child is going to have signs and symptoms of anxiety when they're born because they carry that mental state of the mother. That is all explains to the concept of epigenetics. So do we all have it? Absolutely. But why are some people more, irrational in terms of exposing? And that because, again, mental health is an outcome of an abnormal life being lived. So if their environment is more austere than our environment, then yes, they are more likely to show signs and symptoms of depression than you are going to show it, if that makes sense.
Helen, when a baby is born, let's say you're born to your parents, and let's say they've had the trauma, your genes don't change, right? It's more of a hormonal washing of things like that. You don't have different genes from their trauma, do you?
You don't have different gene sequence. You have a different gene expression.
More of it comes out and so on.
Because epigenetic means what it's on top of gene. The sequence is the same. It doesn't change. But the expression through the science of epigenetic, if you grew up in a war, the epigenetics is going to be different than you growing up in a resort, for example. And why is that important? Because the epigenetic prepares you to survive, right? That's
Gotcha.
Evolution, right? So it's, so why do I have, genes of PTSD, even though I was not exposed to the austere environments that my parents did? Because Mother Nature prepares me in case. But again, I tend to come across a bit irrational because my body is translating those triggers as reminiscent of a war, as if I am in a war. But again, it's important to be aware. It's important to be aware of your environment and your history because you're better able to regulate yourself, that calm yourself down. It's not worth it and it's not big of a deal.
Helen, I warned you if you start bringing up those big words with me, you're going to lose me. So I didn't know that. I didn't know that was on top of that. That's what I was getting at, on top of the genes. All right, Helen, here's one I don't understand. I've been told that a lot of times our mental health is kind of like a beach ball. You blow it up enough and one of the seams might give out, whether it's anxiety or depression. You put enough pressure on somebody. Here's the one I don't quite understand. Schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. That almost seems like more of a black and white thing. That seems like something that wouldn't come just from like anxiety and depression, how those raise up kind of gradually. I don't know enough about schizophrenia, but it seems like that's more of a light switch. How does that come from stress and trauma?
So again, any disease, it's part genetic.
Part genetic, I gotcha.
Part environment.
I gotcha.
But what did we say about genes?
Yes.
They are a predisposition, but they're not predetermination.
Gotcha.
They dispose all of us equally, but it's not a predetermination. What predetermines is the environment, the dysfunctionality. Now, there is a famous study by the CDC as well as Kaiser Permanente. They looked at the impact of exposure to adversity, early exposure of a child being exposed to trauma. Now, what kind of traumas did they look at? Did you grow up in an alcoholic environment or a mother or father using substance use? Was a mother or a father incarcerated? Were they divorced? Did you witness your mother being physically violated in front of you? Did you, were you sexually violated? Were you emotionally violated? Were you physically violated? Again, it was like a 10 extreme exposures to trauma. Dr. Bob Anda and Dr. Vince Politi from CDC and as well as Kaiser Permanente conducted this study on 17,000 individuals, middle-class Americans, right? And they realized that trauma is far more prevalent in this country than they realized. At least 70% of Americans have at least one exposure, and 30% of Americans have at least 4 exposure. What does that mean? It means yes to me being sexually violated. Yes to me being growing up in an addicted environment. Yes to me seeing my mom being violated. Whatever you said yes to, 30% of Americans at least have 4. Now, this is all pre-pandemic. We all know tension, addiction, anxiety is on the horizon because of the last 2 years. I'm sure these numbers are far more serious now. Why is this important? Because they also found that the higher your score, the more you said yes to these adversities, early exposure to trauma, the more negative is your health outcome. So what they found was if you said yes to four of these traumas, you've doubled your risk of developing COPD, doubled your risk to hepatitis C. You are 4 times more likely to develop depression, 6 times more likely to take down your life with suicide, 3 times more likely to develop ischemia, which is the #1 killer in the United States, and 3.5 times more likely to develop lung cancer. So again, trauma does kill, stress does kill, work-related trauma or work-related stress does make us sick. So when you're asking me about schizophrenia, I would say it's part genetic, part environment. But again, yes, we can blame genetic, but genetics is only a predisposition, is not a predetermination. Your environment is what predetermines your exposure to those diseases.
You raised up the point about people being stuck in relationships and so on. And the problem with narcissists is, like, if I told you, Helen, don't go out with somebody who has this kind of personality, Helen, you're not going to like somebody who's boring. If I was setting you up earlier in life with your dates, I'd say, don't go out with someone boring. Don't go out with someone who makes you pay for everything. Don't go out with somebody who likes to speed in their car and that kind of stuff. And you'd say, yes, Mike, I understand this. But it's hard to teach somebody not to go out with a narcissist because a narcissist, they're so good at it. They pull you in, and at some point, I don't want to say it's too late, but it's hard because that's their method.
Well, it's also what this individual takes to the relationship. So the famous book, it's called Mastery of Love by Dan Miguel Ruiz. He's the author of 4 Agreements. I'm sure some of your readers will probably know. Yeah. When you say 4 Agreements, they're like, oh, yes, we know who he is. And in his book called Mastery of Love, he talks about the magic kitchen, right? And he says, imagine yourself being in a kitchen that is full of all kinds of goods, chocolate, fruits, any kind of food you want in the world is in your magic kitchen. That's why it's called magic kitchen. Then a guy comes and knocks on your door with fresh pizza out of the oven. And he says, here, I'll give you a slice of pizza, or I'll give you the whole pizza, but you have to do XYZ for me, right? And what is your response going to be as a girl? You'd be like, why would I do XYZ for you when I have a magic kitchen full of all this good food? No, I'm not going to do what you want. And I can actually even give you, a pizza if you want. So now that's one scenario. Then there is another scenario where there is no magic kitchen and the girl is actually starving. And then the same guy knocks on the door with the pizza. And what happens? I'm going to give you this fresh pizza out of oven and I know you're starving, but you have to do XYZ for me. Okay. So the girl's most likely going to run with it, right? So yes, it's about narcissist being masterful, but also are you a girl coming from an area of abundance, or are you a girl coming from an area of lack? If you are someone who doesn't cherish the joy within and you only find joy outside of you, then chances are you're more likely to fall for a narcissistic guy. Now, I'm not blaming the girl, but it always takes two in any relationship. So where are you? Are you approaching the relationship from area of abundance, or are you approaching the relationship from an area of lack? If you have a lack, if you don't have a magic kitchen in your heart, then chances are you're going to fall for whoever falls on your way.
It makes me think of somebody who is going for a job and the boss is a narcissist. That can be kind of tough, because if you had the magic kitchen, you wouldn't be looking for the damn job. Maybe, you would just be doing whatever you want to do. So the fact that you're not
gonna settle for less.
You're not going to settle. But if you really need the job, that's where maybe some of that bad narcissistic stuff can happen, because if you don't have that, you don't have a kitchen, you're going to starve, let's say.
And this is important. It's having the standards is also important. It goes back to relationships. Because I am so happy within, you're going to have higher standards, right? You're not going to settle for whoever comes your way next. And this is important, especially with pharmacists who are going through burnout. How is this related to the era of Great Resignation? Well, a lot of pharmacists pre-pandemic had to put up with abusive and unbearable work conditions. Why is that? Because of lack, because they were afraid, well, I need to provide for my family. Gee, what's gonna happen if I don't have that paycheck and if I let go of that 6 digits? Then the pandemic happens, Mike, and we see waves and waves of layoffs, and people got by just fine. Nothing happened. And the Great Resignation, the way I look at it, is it's an era of reflection, of realignment. A lot of people now are thinking, was that really a lack, or was that just me being fearful? It's like they're now starting to reflect that what we thought is okay, it's actually not okay. What we thought is normal and healthy is actually making me sick. Because your body tells you enough is enough. Your body tells you no. But the more you try to silence that no, the more you are exposing yourself to chronic diseases. Because what did we say about disease? Disease is the outcome of a life lived, with its experiences, with its abnormalities, with all the abnormal conditions that you've put yourself under. So now, yes, we had to put up with our low standards for work conditions, but the great resignation is a great of reawakening. People are now realigning their standards. They're thinking about that what happened 2 years ago pre-pandemic was not acceptable. And now it's an era of great awakening. And that's why there are masses of Americans leaving their current employer, because they're coming up with better standards, which is huge for themselves.
It's also a time where people feel not as bad making decisions. It's like, hey, I'm not going back to that barber, that bowling league we had. Those guys weren't best for me. I didn't want to tell them, but now we've had the break. It's easier. So even on that way, it's like, maybe somebody who was afraid of their boss, now it's like, hey, I'm just going to do this. So I think it gave a good out for a lot of people, in addition to what you're saying there.
For sure.
I've heard the term complex post-traumatic stress.
CPTSD. Mm-hmm.
The way I understand it is, this is even maybe a harder one for people to admit to. You can't point to maybe this bomb blowing up or this person being, murdered in my family, but it's this constant drip over 10, 15 years of abuse. And if you took maybe one huge thing and maybe divided it by 15 years, every day for 15 years, it would just look like a drip. But that's also trauma.
Yeah. Well, I have complex PTSD, by the way. I was diagnosed when I came back from overseas, because I joined Doctors Without Borders, and I realized I was the one that needed help. But my way of seeking help was I was pretty much being everything for everybody, right? Until I reached rock bottom. And then when I came back to the US, I was diagnosed, which was devastating, because when I was diagnosed, PTSD was looked at as a disability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, of course, my ego was hurt, talking about ego and narcissism. Yes, we all have it.
Yes.
And I have all these degrees and all these accolades, and how in the world can I have this mental disability?
Yeah.
I had a choice to make. Was I going to let PTSD define me, or was I going to shift it and turn it to wisdom? and shared with the outside world. So this kind of goes back to my background and my passion for trauma. Complex PTSD is about, so the way I like to define trauma is what happens inside of us physiologically, psychologically, emotionally. All that happens inside of us because of what happened to us in the past, right? Now, there is a lot to be said about that. There's a lot of wisdom to be said about that. Why is that? What happened is gone, but what happened inside of us can be healed. So that's one definition of trauma. But when it comes to CPTSD, complex PTSD, it changes the definition of trauma, because trauma is also about what didn't happen to you. What didn't happen to you. As a child, I didn't have my father around. My father was gone, he was a prisoner of war, right? So I grew up with no father figure. So it didn't happen to me. My mother was busy providing care for all her children in a patriarchal society. So she was very stressed out. But as a child, how did I translate that? How did I take that? Well, I felt like I was being abandoned by a woman that I needed her love and affection so badly. Again, I didn't have the cognitive functioning to explain, well, my mom is doing her best, but that's not how a child looks at it. I was abandoned. I was neglected. How do I take that into my relationships? Any signs of not getting the affection that I need is reminiscent of my past, that I feel like I'm being abandoned. So that's complex PTSD. It's a prolonged exposure. It's a lifelong experience of hypervigilance, and how your brain, the amygdala, the body's alarm system, that's what amygdala is. It's basically when something gets burned in the oven, the alarm system goes off, right? That is your brain's amygdala tells you danger, 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 right? So I grew up with a hyperactive amygdala, with a sloppy amygdala, which means even if something is not burning in the oven, my alarm goes off and it misinterprets things. I'm constantly scared. I'm constantly hyper alert because of the environment that I grew up in, with no father and with no affection from my mother. So complex PTSD is about something that the child did not get exposed to over a prolonged period of time, and how that actually is taken over to their adult life.
I had a situation for about 20 years of my life that if I explained it to somebody, this happened to me, they're like, that happens every day. It's like, yeah, but it happened every day for 20 years. It builds on you.
It does.
The way I understand some of this, Helen, is you said that it's in the past, but your body feels like it's present. And then sometimes if you get triggered, like if someone looks at you a little bit funny or something like that, instead of just saying, he looked at me funny, I'm not going to judge what that was. But you get these feelings going, you get triggered, and instead of blaming the past that's over, you put all those feelings into this person who maybe didn't even know he looked at you funny, and now you revved all this up again.
Yeah, which means who has all the ammunition built up? You do. You do, right? And who is the trigger? The outside is, but does the trigger warrant all this ammunition for you? Right. It doesn't. Which means it falls on you to control. Now you said, yes, it happened in the past, but remember what I said about the amygdala. The body's alarm system, amygdala becomes sloppy, but it's not the job of the amygdala to tell you that it happens in the past or it happened today. It's not. That's the job of the hippocampus. Hippocampus is the body's memory part. But when there is too much trauma, too too fast, too soon, your body's alarm system takes over the memory. Because when you're about to be attacked by a bear in the forest, are you going to think about now, future? No, your number one priority is survival, to run away from the bear, which means you're not going to remember. Why do a lot of veterans have signs and symptoms of PTSD, have a lot of flashbacks? Because what happened in the war haunts them every day, because the amygdala is sloppy. There needs to be a lot of metacognition to calm their brain, to calm their amygdala, so they can live a happy life, a peaceful life. But a brain of a traumatic individual doesn't know peace. They cannot feel safe within their body because their body alarm system is so activated that it's constantly looking for cues to protect you. So while the individual was making fun, the amygdala is going to take it out of context.
Yep.
And it builds all this ammunition. And what do you look like to the outside world? You look like a neurotic. You're like, gee, so what if he just made a joke? But they don't understand your background. And that's why the work is important. Metacognition, such as yoga, mindfulness, meditation, to calm your nerves down, so you don't take things out of context.
I always thought it was noble of me to deal with someone right away and not even need time to think about it, because I know the person I am and so on. But with some CPTSD, your amygdala goes so fast that your frontal cortex, it needs a chance to catch up. And so if you let something sit, even for 5 seconds or 5 minutes or 5 days, your amygdala is still always going to do its job, but your frontal brain gives yourself a chance to catch up. And then you can say, well, who cares if it catches up? Your amygdala did its job. It's like, who cares unless it was your 12-year-old daughter that said something and you attacked her like it was, someone from the past instead of your beautiful daughter. So you can do it if you want to, but you're going to be an asshole to a lot of people until you have your brain catch up to you and at least have it balance.
Yeah, I have a friend actually who was always so combative. And if I wasn't trauma informed, I would be very upset and very offended. But I know this individual. I know his background. I know his environment. So a lot of times when I ask him a question, he totally takes it out of context. But not everybody's trauma informed. Not everybody. So they might look at you as an individual who is extremely rude, who is just obnoxious, who is, whatever, if they don't have an appreciation to your background. This goes back to the two roads that I like to talk about, the high road and the low road that I'm sure you've heard about. So when you get triggered, when someone gets under your skin via email, it's so gratifying to send a nasty email back, right? You send a nasty email back and a few seconds later, you regret the decision. Regret the decision.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because the way the brain is developed, the trigger, the stimulus from outside first goes through the low road. The low road goes to the amygdala. Because the way our brain is developed, we have the survival brain, the reptilian brain, then we have the limbic brain, and then we have the frontal cortex, right? The part of the brain that is responsible for, cognitive functioning, executive decisions, right? But that part does not develop until we're like, 25, 27?
Yeah.
So which means we're children until we're 25, 27, because we're not mature adults until the cognitive brain is fully developed. Now, the low road goes through the amygdala first. And then a few seconds, milliseconds, if you only hold off before you press the button, the signal will continue its way to the cortex, bottom up. Cortex is here. Amygdala is here. Reptilian brain is here. Bottom up, right? Now, the amygdala is going to do its job. It's going to say danger, danger, danger. And you're going to be like, oh, this nasty person is sending me this nasty message. How dare they? I'm going to fight back. And then you send the message through the low road because the low road went through the amygdala. Then a few seconds later, the cortex gets the message. And the cortex tells the amygdala, hey, that was not worth so much tension. So I tell people this is important because you're angry. Write the email, but don't send it. Write it because that's gratifying. It's gratifying. Sleep on it and come back the day after or come back a couple hours later and you're going to be like, holy crap, I was going to send this. I can't imagine how many times I've done this and I've laughed at myself and I've caught myself in shock because amygdala is blinding. The emotional hijack is blinding.
There's a book, it was a Dale Carnegie book, either about anxiety or about how to win friends. I think it was the anxiety one, but it talked about Abe Lincoln doing this, same method. And I remember about 15 years ago, we had a cottage and I had to buy all of the mattresses for our family all at one time. And the mattress guy screwed me over somehow. But it's hard to define a screwing over of $29. That's all it was. But for some reason, I was triggered. And I wrote this nasty letter to him and it was just terrible. And I said, I think I still have it in my file cabinet. I knew it was stupid to send it, but I spelled it all out and got it out of you, and give yourself a chance to catch up.
Yeah. And a lot of time, especially with this individual that I know has a lot of trauma, I don't argue at the moments. And I think when things, and again, I'm not a saint. I'm sure I have my moments where I'm like, gee, I could have done better. We're all human after all, right? But there are times where when the individual is regulated, never push back when amygdala is in a hijack, right? But when things are calm and you be like, I think this is what you meant, right? And you would be surprised how many relationships, how many marriages would be saved if we only knew the tactics of how to handle any communication and not let the amygdala hijack our brain. And even if it does hijack, is there a way you can work around it? And that's not easy. That's not because I've fallen for the trap so many times myself. So
growing up in different situations, kind of the modeling to me was, don't say anything until the amygdala hits and then something blows up. You're either really happy or you blow up. And I remember one time this person said, there was a better way to treat your employee. And then it's like, what do you mean? I had a right to do this and that. She said, well, you could have just told them. And I'm like, really? You mean I don't have to be quiet or blow up? There's actually a middle where I can just talk to people? Yeah.
No, I know. It's important to find some tools and resources to regulate. I know my outlet is to find a trustworthy friend to talk to when things bother me. I try not to internalize it, because that's also part of regulating yourself. Meditation is important. Running outside is important. Nature is important, but also, I find a lot of value in that deep human connection and how I can use that to regulate my body and have this individual kind of hear me out. A lot of time, all you have to do is just listen.
Yeah.
Just listen.
Sometimes I knew it was good to talk to people, but I found myself complaining to them when I probably should have gone more directly to the person. But that's kind of how it was modeled for me. It's tricky stuff.
It really helps individuals to self-reflect. One of the tools that I utilize when I give talks and trainings, I use the saboteurs. Now, you might ask me, what is that? Saboteurs are basically attributes in us that sabotages our relationships. They're called saboteurs. Now, the significance of saboteurs is it all goes back to the unfinished childhood baggage that we all have, right? Why is this important? Because if you were not validated, you're going to crave for validation. You're going to be a perfectionist. You're going to be a controller. Why a lot of narcissists crave to be an exec? Because that's their way of controlling the situation so they don't get abused anymore, right? Or they don't get violated anymore. So these saboteurs, I actually give the assessment. I actually just gave this talk to the 50 state execs. There are 49 other execs plus myself, plus their president-elects, and they all took the assessment. And you would be shocked. Majority of the room were controllers. Majority of the room were controllers. We're talking 9 out of 10, 9.6 out of 10, 9.9 out of 10. I wish you could see the shock on their face. But perfectionism is good. Being an overachiever is good. But too much of perfectionism, too much of an overachievement, too much of controller can be sabotaging to you, to your loved one, as well as your working relationships. Now, they were all execs. Did I tell them you are the problem? No, but it was about self-reflection. If you are a 90.9% controller, it means you need to do something about that because you're intimidating. You're scaring the crap out of your staff. You're scaring your staff. You're intimidating your people. If you're like 90.9% perfectionist, which means your staff is going to say, regardless of what I do, this individual is not going to be happy because there's too much of a perfectionist. I usually use this assessment and then I talk about the root cause of the saboteur in them. And I relate it back to their early childhood. So there's a lot of reflection, trauma reflection, dysfunctionality reflection. And it's a very emotional talk that I give because it makes all these people super powerful, super impactful to kind of reflect. And there's so much vulnerability that you see for the very first time for them to kind of, demonstrate and reflect to you. It's fascinating.
It's really interesting answering those tests. Maybe they're looking for a certain mental deficiency, for lack of a better word, but they're looking either for OCD, narcissism, depression, or anxiety. So you answer these things. And my family tends a little bit towards OCD as a way to combat anxiety or whatever. And it's interesting answering these stuff because it'll ask questions like, I'm the best person in the world and I'm this. And you go down these things, it's like, who in the hell would answer yes to that? And then you go down something else. It's like, who in the hell would answer yes to those questions? But then you go down something where you kind of are, like, let's say it's an OCD column. You're like, of course I put this in order. And of course I do this. It's like those people in those 4 columns are nuts. But when you go down the column that is defining you, you're like, why wouldn't you be that way? But unfortunately, you're as far to the outside as somebody else would if they weren't part of that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Talking about hypervigilance, you can congratulate yourself for being hypervigilant. You can say, my amygdala is doing great. I'm picking up all these issues. I'm alive still. I haven't died. The panther hasn't come and eaten me. I'm keeping my eyes out. You can do that. But at what expense? At heart disease, at not being able to be present in a conversation. There's a lot of ways to congratulate yourself, but a lot suffers.
Exactly. For sure. For sure. Yes, I totally agree.
Helen, when I went on Amazon, you've got a book on there, but I know you're working on some other things.
So my first book, Trading Grenades for Candy, it's my memoir. It talks about my childhood. It talks about my family. It talks about immigration to the U.S. It talks about discrimination. It's everything Helen finding herself in the wilderness, coming to this country, as a young child and, being spotted by the U.S. Marine who deployed to my country, finding this child with a grenade in her hand and then them waving back the candy at me in exchange for the grenade. And then coming to the U.S. and finding myself and, trying to give back to this country that has done so many good things to me because it's a land of immigrants and I feel like I owe America so much. But then the story has a lot of trauma. Has a lot of trauma that I portray in my life story, but unfortunately we didn't get to it in book number 1. So book number 2, it talks about what is it to live with PTSD every day. And I take advantage of my story. I talk about trauma, but for my own voice, for my own experiences. And I also provide some tools and resources to kind of regulate yourself as a significant other, as a loved one, as a supervisor, as a colleague. So I'm hoping that the second book will be huge for the pharmacy community, for the medical community, especially, or for an average citizen to see how my story opening up about my vulnerability, to help people, take advantage of some of the things that I talk about and also some of the tools that I share so they can have a better quality of life moving forward.
I had a guest on a few months ago and he was talking about how his new bride and he were driving and someone T-boned him and she died. And I said, it's hard for me to even talk about anything at this point because things are so small compared to that. And he said, Mike, you might think so, but there's some finality and peace and forgiveness in what I did. He said, some people going through divorce or doing this, they're having it a lot tougher. He said, don't compare. I imagine though, Helen, when people come up to you though, to talk about trauma, they're like, I brought this up earlier. They're like, Helen, I shouldn't talk to you. I've never been in a war-torn area with a grenade and things like that. What do you tell people? How do you say it's okay? You don't have to compare.
So I like to look up to Viktor Frankl, the Jewish Holocaust survivor. I just adore that man. And he talks about the wisdom of suffering. He went through a Holocaust. His wife was pregnant. She died in Auschwitz. He lost his parents in Auschwitz. And he talks about how if there is any meaning in life, there is also meaning in suffering. And that's what I like to talk about. When I told you I was diagnosed with complex PTSD, I was devastated. I had a choice to make. I could be just let the disability define who I was or turn the suffering or the label to wisdom. So I chose the latter because there's a lot of wisdom to be said about suffering. Survivors of trauma, these individuals have a lot of wisdom to share with the world. I like to travel around the world, and I would say I would definitely pick a trauma survivor to accompany me in exploring the world, because there is wisdom. There is wisdom, and that's how I would like to look at suffering in life, for sure.
We all have suffered some trauma, and I think the person maybe that has felt the trauma and have dealt with it, they're a path ahead almost of everybody else, because everybody else is going to feel it somehow. It's like your time is coming. So people that have already been there have a lot to share.
For sure. For sure. Yes. We live in a society that exploits trauma in all of us.
Like advertising and stuff.
It's everywhere in our school system, in our healthcare system, in TV and everything. What we think it's normal, what we think is healthy is neither healthy nor normal. What we think is healthy is making us sick.
And it's selling you things to soothe that instead of getting to the base of stuff.
It's the lack. They capitalize on the lack.
Capitalize on your lack. Absolutely. Well, Helen, thanks for meeting. Thanks for bringing up these important issues, which sometimes we either maybe hide a little bit or sometimes they're just not on the front burner.
My pleasure. And I'm glad. I'm glad that my voice helps individuals to figure out what is it that's going on in their life. It goes back to the point I was making in an article that pharmacists are coming out with signs and symptoms of PTSD. And Mike, that article went viral. A pharmacist said that you gave us a voice. We had all the signs and symptoms, but we didn't know what it was. And you helped us identify what it was. So a lot of times just identifying an emotion, identifying as suffering for what it is, it really helps. So, and I'm glad to be a source to my colleagues in the profession. And if anybody needs to reach out to me, they can find me on social media. And I am more than happy to be an informational source to trauma if I could be of any help.
All right, Helen. Very good. Thank you again. And we will keep in touch.
Thanks.